Good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Deb Sullivan, trainer from the Academic Affairs Office, and want to welcome you in one of our continuing series of Ready for Primetime presentations by faculty. It's partnered with Talk About Teaching Times, where we can learn from each other about teaching and then also learn about the scholarship that our faculty are doing. So this morning we have the pleasure of having Dr. Dan Ritchie from the English department speaking to us about connections between postmodernism and intercultural understanding. Dan?
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate very much the work that Anne and others in the library have done in setting up this event. This presentation comes out of a book that I just had published from Baylor University Press. There are copies here. I suppose I could sell them to you. They're pretty expensive. They list for $50. I can sell to you for $40. I'm sorry about that, but that's about the best I can do. I think we're way too loud, aren't we, Anne?
We want to catch the people behind.
Okay, all right. This talk comes from the second to last chapter in this book. And what the book as a whole does is it links critics of Enlightenment in the 18th century with similar criticisms from our own time. As I taught the 18th century, which is my specialty, I kept finding interesting parallels between, say, the way Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe comes to knowledge through his narrative, through his story, and current narrative theology. Or the critique of technology in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and the critique that you find in Wendell Berry and other contemporary writers. We associate the Enlightenment with knowledge that is rational or empirical. It criticizes the personal, it criticizes the traditional, it relegates the aesthetic to matters of mere opinion in Kant and others. And yet many of the best 18th century writers, the writers that we still read today, were quite critical of Enlightenment ways of knowing. They were skeptical of the claims of progress that are associated with the Enlightenment. And so what I decided to do was link 7 of these critiques from the 18th century with current critiques by authors of our own day, or just before our own day. And again, this particular chapter focuses on tradition as a way of knowing, and it explores the link between an 18th century figure, Edmund Burke, who died in 1797, and Hans-Georg Gadamer, who died in 2000. He was 100 years old, cut down in the prime of his youth. Now, this chapter came out of a comment that I often heard from my students. They would often say that they could never escape their own prejudices. And they weren't just criticizing the prejudices of the past as outworn beliefs that could or should be put behind us. They were also including their own opinions. And they would frequently preface their comments by saying, speaking from my own biased point of view, and earlier in my teaching career, this troubled me. I thought, like I came out of more of an Enlightenment modern college, I would think, why bother coming to school at all if you can't put your biases behind you, if your education can't penetrate and overturn those prejudices. But now I think my students were onto something and are onto something because they weren't just looking at their own biases or prejudices as necessarily bad. They were part of who they were. In other words, they were representing a new generation, whether you call it Gen X or Gen Y or millennials or whatever the current term is, someone who realizes we can't approach the present simply as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, which was Locke's term in the late 17th century. Or someone who sees her past as simply something to be cast off and set aside. It's not as though the modern assumptions, the Enlightenment assumptions, have vanished, however. People my age and older, I would say, still hold to them. I heard a speaker at a recent Ivy League commencement congratulate the graduates for having left behind many of the prejudices with which they entered college. And I looked quickly around at all the parents there to see how they took this insult to their child rearing. But of course they were they didn't care, they weren't listening. And if you read college curricula, which are mostly written by people my age, they often encourage students to wrestle with their own prejudices and biases, and they urge students to think critically. So thinking critically apparently is the opposite of having prejudices. Thinking critically is the opposite of having biases. Rare is the American school that acknowledges the value of rooting one's critical thought in a tradition. In his recent critique of Harvard's lack of a curriculum, former Dean Harry Lewis writes, "There seems to be nothing in particular that Harvard wants its students to know about the United States of America." Perhaps, and this is interesting, perhaps Harvard no longer thinks of itself as an American college, but as a global college. But is that possible? Can you really embrace the world if you don't embrace your own past in some way? Well, this talk will look at a division within postmodern thought on how to approach the past. On the one hand, many dominant postmodern thinkers have regarded past writings and tradition with suspicion. And the hermeneutics of suspicion is almost a cliche now. It's become a methodological tool in the hands of many postmodern approaches to literature and culture, from feminism and post-colonial and new historicist treatments. They typically assume that the primary task of the interpreter is to uncover and criticize the prejudices embodied in earlier literature. This phrase, the hermeneutics of suspicion, comes from a book by Paul Ricoeur in his description of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, the three masters of suspicion. And I think you can see this hermeneutic even in commentators who are rather sympathetic to the past, like Martha Nussbaum in her book Cultivating Humanity. It's a kind of a defense of liberal education, but in the book it's clear that the job of liberal education is to approach world citizenship, a concept she often describes but doesn't really define. Above all, she says, education for world citizenship requires transcending the inclination to define oneself primarily in terms of local group loyalties and identities. And if you read the book, everywhere a local identity or loyalty is encountered, it is criticized. And the parade of bad guys is pretty predictable. They're all traditionalists who are holding progressive people back. Now, I have reproduced on this PowerPoint a sign from the campaign to defeat Proposition 8 in California. In Proposition 8 in 2008, marriage was reestablished in California as between a man and a woman. But you see that the campaign poster equates it with hate. So if you're for traditional marriage, you must be for hate. And that's a typical way, I think, of looking at the past. And some of us who went to a family conference, there was a Catholic family conference down at St. Thomas on Saturday, we were greeted by GLBT protesters with these signs and shouting at us about hate and so on. There's nothing like people shouting at you to help encourage you that you may actually be doing something good. Okay, so that's one side of postmodernism. On the other side, we have Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he's a philosopher who emphasized the limits to knowledge, the limits to knowledge. And his thought also has affinities with postmodern thought. He's done more than any recent thinker to show the necessity of embracing one's history, and even the prejudices or prejudgments, as he used the term in his book. He uses both terms. We enter every discussion with certain prejudgments, Vorurteil in German. And he says that the issue of prejudice, understood in its historical complexity, is the point of departure for the problem of interpretation, the hermeneutical problem. This is a book about interpretation. It's a book about hermeneutics. And Gadamer specifically refers to Edmund Burke's critique of the Enlightenment when he begins his discussion. What Gadamer says is that he is going to set himself the task of justifying true prejudices by rational knowledge, a task which he acknowledges can never be complete. And that's important too. It can never be complete. So it's not as though you finish being rational and then you can cast aside the prejudice or cast aside the upbringing that you brought to the table. No, there are limits to knowledge, and you can't ever be completely rational, empirical, logical. So let's go back to Burke here, much more comfortable in the 18th century, and pick up that division that we're talking about at the beginning. Burke criticizes the blind prejudices of his era that simply ratified the world as it happened to be. And if you read his work, he's critical of prejudices against Catholics and against Indians, that is, East Indians, and others. Nevertheless, prejudgments do find their place within the irreducibly historical setting from which we set out on our quest for knowledge, in Burke's view. The historical, political, and even aesthetic traditions of which one is a part cannot be eradicated. So I put a garden up here. Landscape gardening is actually very important in 18th century thought, and of course it's representing the aesthetic or the beautiful. And you can't represent these traditions simply to principles that promise to guide us in whatever situation a neutral observer is going to encounter. By prejudice, Burke means a judgment that is made before all the facts can be known. And in his view, all of the facts can never be known. And that's the nub of the disagreement between Burke and the Enlightenment folks that are on the horizon at the time. The true judgment can never be a matter of simply applying abstract principle objectively to the facts that you have at hand. It involves much more subtle, far-ranging decisions about how to interpret the present as a part in light of the whole of experience, which would, of course, include the past. And so that may seem a little bit abstract, but that's the philosophical difference. Burke is so deeply aware of the split between his approach to knowledge and that of his Enlightenment opponents that he sometimes writes as if he's just given up his prerogative to speak about reason or truth at all. His judgment, which is based on prudence and taste, so again we have a garden that's in very good taste on the overhead, his judgment is simply too far removed from their rationalistic approach. He embraces the moral sentiments, which are so nearly connected with early prejudice, he writes, as to be almost one and the same thing. And he endorses this against the, quote, perfectly systematic revolutionary truths that he's confronted with in the French Revolution, 1789. And if it comes down to a choice between prejudice and the contemporary Enlightenment approaches to truth in 1789-90, Burke goes so far as to defend prejudice. And of course, this is the target of the Enlightenment. Now, I've reproduced a famous paragraph from Burke's Reflections. This is one of the books that figures prominently in this chapter that I've written. And I'd like to read it. You see, sir, that in this enlightened age, I am bold enough to confess that we are generally men of untaught feelings, that instead of casting away all our old prejudices, we cherish them to a very considerable degree. And to take more shame to ourselves, we cherish them because they are prejudices. And the longer they've lasted, the more generally they have prevailed, the more we cherish them. Many of our men of speculation, instead of exploding general prejudices, employ their sagacity to discover the latent wisdom which prevails in them. And if they find what they seek, and they seldom fail, they think it more wise to continue the prejudice with the reason involved than to cast away the coat of prejudice and leave nothing but the naked reason. Because prejudice, with its reason, has a motive to give action to that reason, and an affection, important word, affection, to give it permanence. Affection, of course, links in with Aristotle. It would link in with Jonathan Edwards, if you knew Edwards, to give it permanence. Prejudice is of ready application in the emergency. It previously engages the mind in a steady course of wisdom and virtue, and does not leave the man hesitating in the moment of decision, skeptical, puzzled, and unresolved. Prejudice renders a man's virtue his habit, and not a series of unconnected acts. Through just prejudice, that is, a reasonable prejudice, his duty becomes part of his nature. I'll give you one example. This is Earth Day. I have a friend who came to a seminar I did a couple of years ago on Alexis de Tocqueville, and we were talking about the American tendency to volunteer, a prejudice in favor of getting involved and just getting out there and doing things, whereas Tocqueville says if you have a project in France, they'll wait for the government to do it. Americans don't do that. We form associations. That's part of our nature, our habits as Americans. Okay, this friend of mine had gone back to France to teach, and she had this kind of ecological Earth Day event. 30 people showed up. 29 were Americans. One was a French person, and she was from the mayor's office who came to get her picture taken. So that is an American prejudice. I think it's a good one. that we volunteer, we get involved when there's a problem, and it's different from, say, French society. Okay. Now, Burke was not the only author of his age to lament the passing of prejudices. Moses Mendelssohn, the grandfather of the composer, has some nice writing about it. And there's a fantastic satire called Prejudice Conquered by a French cleric. It says, all we need to get over to dispose of all the tens of thousands of corpses that the Reign of Terror has produced through its overcoming of prejudice is to get over the prejudice of cannibalism. Because France is starving now, and if only we could eat the corpses of the people that the enlightened folks have cut the heads off of, we'd be fine. And of course, this French clergyman is satirizing this notion that we can simply get rid of our past, get rid of our traditions. It must be admitted, however, that the most influential voices, then as now, were on the other side. Voltaire had given lip service to the defense of prejudice, but he defines it as an opinion without judgment, which of course Burke would never accept. It is a prejudgment in Burke's view, because we can't know all the facts. And Voltaire limits these acceptable prejudices to opinions that parents teach their children. So when they go away to college, they get rid of them all. But are Voltaire's assumptions valid? When you read Candide, it seems, if you're carried along by Voltaire, that a moment's reflection will enable you to unburden yourself of all the old habits, all the old customs and tastes that produce narrow-mindedness, and you'll be able to become a universal world citizen of the Enlightenment, like Voltaire. But most of the critiques of tradition are themselves based on unexamined assumptions, perhaps even prejudices, some of which we share today, like the assumption of progress, that tomorrow should and will produce a future that is better than the past, or the prejudice that equality should trump every other virtue, virtues of excellence, of religious truth, of family structure, of liberty, and so on. That belief in equality is the strongest American value, but is our prejudice to act first and sometimes only on the basis of equality, is that justified? Or how about individualism? Individualism really flows out of equality. That'll take a little bit longer to demonstrate, but the assumption by Justice Kennedy that each individual has a constitutional right to define the meaning of the universe for himself, that's in the Casey decision. Is that correct? Are these prior judgments about progress and equality and individualism, are they always correct? Well, let's come up to the present now, to Hans-Georg Gadamer. And Gadamer accepts neither the Enlightenment notions of objectivity nor the extreme postmodern attitude of suspicion. In his book, Truth and Method, which is the other part of this chapter in my book, he revives this philosophical enterprise of encountering persons and traditions as truly other, and that I hope you'll see I'm foreshadowing the intercultural piece here, as truly different from oneself. Apart from a personal encounter with these others, there's no way to learn the significant things that these persons and traditions have to teach us. The primary way this occurs, Gadamer explains, is through our interpretation of older or traditionary texts. They are really other. The study of interpretation, that is hermeneutics, thus becomes central to his book, and I think it's central to Burke as well. And it differs from the modern attempt to eliminate all of the personal history that you bring to a text. It differs as well from many postmodern theories, again, that interpret language as primarily an expression of power. For Gadamer, as for Burke, tradition is something that we belong to and is yet other. Where Burke stressed the element of belonging, Gadamer introduces the equally important element of difference. Tradition is other than oneself. And we certainly see this in humanities in trying, or in CWC, where you're trying to get students to sympathize and empathize with the past. To encounter tradition is to encounter elements of both the alien and the familiar. And both elements are essential in understanding ourselves and the world. Gadamer reaches back to a German term, Bildung, that has connotations that embrace education, personal development, character formation, the moral imagination, and so on. He says, Bildung is the properly human way of developing one's natural talents and capacities. And it consists in being able to return to oneself from an experience with the other. In the process of development, then, the individual grows beyond his or her own natural existence to experience the social world that's constituted by custom and language, including the customs of the past, the language of the past, and then returns to a more mature identity. So the goal of education for Gadamer is not to purify ourselves of our prejudices that have been part of our social world. Francis Bacon had talked about this, Martha Nussbaum talks about this, and again, people my age still talk about this a lot. Instead, it's to recognize that our very consciousness owes itself to history. We are part of our origins. And Gadamer writes that genuine experience is the experience of one's own finitude. We can't make ourselves a blank slate, become perfectly neutral, and sort of infinitely gather facts together. The mind cannot even manage its own origins. It's deeper than that. It is not the master of its own identity. Again, that's the prejudice of individualism that would say otherwise. Instead, the mind brings its experiences, histories, and prejudgments into the present as a horizon that makes up one's range of vision. So I've reproduced this famous painting by Monet where it's unclear exactly where the horizon is. But there is a horizon there. But where does it fuse with that other horizon? That's what Gadamer talks about time and again as the dynamic of true education. It's a fusing of horizons. Let's see. Let me read this other quote from Gadamer here. I interpreted a little bit and then I quoted him on your handout. You don't try to create the past. That's not the goal of history either. Simply recreating the past as it really was. I'm looking for Kevin Craig here. He can quote it to you in German. Go ahead, Kevin. The past as it really was. We'll hear that later. Nor do we encounter the past simply to interrogate it, as happens so often in literary criticism today, which implies a superior vantage point from the present. Again, another prejudice of the present. Still less do we simply abandon our past. Rather, a person trying to understand a text is prepared for it to tell him something. That is why a hermeneutically trained consciousness must, from the start, be sensitive to the text's alterity, its otherness. But this kind of sensitivity involves neither neutrality with respect to content, nor the extinction of oneself, but the foregrounding of one's own four meanings, that is, becoming aware of them, four meanings and prejudices. The important thing is to be aware of one's own bias, so the text can present itself in all its otherness, and thus assert its own truth against one's own four meanings. True understanding for Gadamer, then, occurs when there is a fusion of horizons between past and present. The traditional text creates a tension with the reader who becomes conscious of his or her own horizon, history, perspectives, and prejudices. Okay, so let me finish up with a word about Burke and intercultural understanding, and then I'll have time for questions. Now, Burke was very aware of the historical nature of his own prejudice in favor of the British Constitution. He knew that this was one of his four judgments, and he approached every reform with the question of how this reform, how this part could fit into a whole, how the part fits into a whole. You see, it's a little more aesthetic, isn't it, than purely logical. To use Gadamer's terms, he knew that his horizon was not constructed from the facts about the history of England, Ireland, and so on, but from more sources in the Western tradition than he could name. Legal sources, literary sources, philosophical, religious, and so on. And so his writings are filled with allusions and quotations. It makes it very difficult to read for the first time. That's why you should always start by reading Burke for the second time. But these authors are part of his tradition, and he engages in conversation, he engages them in conversation about the present. It's important move. They are his contemporaries. Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible, Virgil, Horace. They are all his contemporaries in a conversation with the present. And they truly reshape the present, and in turn, they are reshaped by the present. That's what I mean by fusion of horizon. Gadamer puts it this way: tradition exists only in constantly becoming other than it is. So it's not as though the tradition is something inert on a 6-foot shelf of Harvard classics. And unfortunately, I think that happens sometimes in some defenses of liberal education. We have to know them because they've been important to the past. That's kind of Harvard's way of looking at these books. That I don't think it works very well. Gadamer says tradition is not inert. It exists only as it is affirmed, embraced, and cultivated, which means that everyone who engages his or her tradition does so with a certain degree of freedom. We're not bound by one interpretation of the past. We're always recreating it. The person who looks back to the preservative function of tradition is also using reason and changing it, although doing it in a different way from that of a progressive who has only the future in view. We're always situated within traditions, writes Gadamer, whether we acknowledge it or not. Tradition is active in all change. Burke's imaginative reconstruction of the Constitution also modifies his own tradition. He uses estate metaphors, metaphors of houses and landscape gardens, to be images of the Constitution. And what that does is it helps him explain that the Constitution is in a perpetual cycle of decay, fall, renovation, and progression. And so it's no surprise to find him participating in that process. He developed a theory of the British Constitution that would have made way for Irish Catholics to vote if he had won in Parliament. He almost never won in Parliament. His theory of the state church established a theory for toleration, and you can see that in the reflections. And his theory of the British Empire, which was still young at the time, developed so that its rule in India could only be justified if it somehow benefited the inhabitants of India. And this is a political cartoon illustrating that point. Burke has a long nose and glasses, and he's trying to impeach the Governor General of India, Warren Hastings, whom he accused of essentially robbing the inhabitants of India. He was unsuccessful in that too, at least in the short run. But the point that I'm trying to make is that by getting people to sympathize with Ireland, India, and Catholics, Burke is trying to expand intercultural understanding, not by setting aside the British Constitution, but by showing how it's made for more fully embracing people other than ourselves. And he gets it from his understanding of tradition. Of Englishmen who stayed in Great Britain all their lives, Burke was the most multicultural man of his age. And that's what I mean by increasing cross-cultural understanding. We begin where we've come from. We continue with the resources that we carry, and we don't just carry baggage either. We also carry the capacity to love and cherish, which helps us move out from our homes and our families, where our public affections begin, onto the general map of mankind, as Burke put it. It doesn't really work to try to erase the horizon that we bring to the discussion. Actually, Nietzsche has a great metaphor of trying to erase the horizon. That's not the way. I don't think it's going to work. Character development occurs as our horizon fuses with the traditions, past and present, and the others that we encountered. And in the process, it's not just our minds that are changed and our reason, but our moral imagination and the affections of the heart that are broadened and changed by this enlargement of sympathies. Thank you very much. Now we have a fair amount of time. Well, we have at least 10 minutes. It's 10 till 11. So if there are some questions that you'd like to raise.
Dan, why did you think that this was an important topic to bring to our community?
It comes from the book that I just published, and I knew the humanities students had just read Burke, so I thought it would fit in well with something that they had done. The other issue is I think that we're in the current age we're moving beyond postmodernism, really. And there's an interesting book by James Davison Hunter. I think it's called "Not the Way to Change the World" or "The Way Not to Change the World." So I think a lot of people are exploring alternatives to postmodernism, and I think tradition is one of those ways, along with beauty and so on. And I do think there's a hunger among younger people for tradition. Many younger people are attracted to the Catholic Church, they're attracted to Orthodoxy, they're rediscovering the Church Fathers and so on. So that's how I thought of it.
Yeah, I really appreciate your presentation and the importance of tradition, the importance of knowing where you come from and recognizing what that brings, not just as baggage, as you said. I think one of the problems we have sometimes is that we limit the traditions we think are valid.
Yeah.
And so we'll stick to, in the West, for example, just the canon instead of all the small traditions that we have. And so we ignore groups like the Roma and all groups that have been marginalized and still have things to teach us. So I think that your argument clearly doesn't go that direction. If you really look at your argument is that we need to understand tradition in a maybe more powerful sense, in a more inclusive sense, and find ways to create dialogue that allows that to happen.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that some traditions have the tendency to close off and close out other groups.
Right.
There's a real generosity of sentiment, generosity of feeling in both of these authors. And Burke himself was raised in Ireland by Quakers, and his mother was Catholic. So he had all of these different elements within his tradition.
Right.
His biography helps, I think.
Which probably pushed the direction of being a multicultural person you talked about.
Yes,
Because of that
and
background.
his encounter with India is different because it's almost entirely intellectual, not only intellectual, but that he did by reading. I don't want to say
Thanks.
too much more.
This is maybe unfair, but just to take a very, very specific issue as we speak, the National Day of Prayer, which has been part of American tradition and which some Christians would be willing to take up guns to defend. So, and it's a real question, not a fake question on my part. How do we embrace that in a pluralistic society that demands that it be castrated of anything exclusively Christian? You know, as the church, it's a question for the church. How do we look at that powerful tradition, and what do we do with it? You know, when a federal judge in Wisconsin has proclaimed that it's unconstitutional. You know, that may be an unfair question because it's very, very specific and contemporary.
Well, I do think looking at the history is very important, not just of the National Day of Prayer, but there were, as you know, there were national prayers way back, even before the founding of this country, and proclamations regarding Thanksgiving and from Lincoln's time and even before onward. I think certainly if you don't think that mode of prayer is valid, then you don't participate in it, and that's fine. It does suggest, for those who do participate in it, it does suggest that they see a role for civil religion.
Yeah, that's quite the point.
And if you don't see that role coming from a more Anabaptist tradition, then you won't want to participate.
Yeah,
But
that's it. Yeah, that's it. I think that as Christians we need to maybe have a conversation about somewhere about the value of civil religion. I mean, there's
Right.
good arguments for it,
right.
for and against.
Well, Tocqueville is the great source.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan, for this presentation. I find it really very interesting, particularly the critique of modernity. I don't have a lot of sympathy for the Enlightenment project, but without prejudgment, I want to say that the use of postmodernism to understand the cultures of the world sounds to me like a little bit Eurocentric. Because if you go to Chimaltenango in Guatemala, they are not necessarily, they are not probably in the modern stage, talk less of the postmodern stage. If you go to some parts of Africa, like where I come from, people have not probably reached the modern stage. So, but when you see, there are a lot of third world intellectuals who come here and they get into this kind of debate with their colleagues in the West, and because America is postmodern, we assume that everybody experiences the same history. So I have some concern about that, not because I don't want to engage in postmodern discussion, but I think it's dangerous to just assume that the people in Monongahela and the people in Cochabamba are all postmodern. So that's one point that I would like to really make. The second thing is, you see, as a sociologist, we do a lot of conceptualization, and I find really like you leave yourself a lot of attack from different directions because, for instance, prejudgments or prejudice, there are many sources of prejudice. And sometimes when you look at the empirical literature, the research that has been conducted, some of them, I think you would be very uncomfortable just going directly and talk about prejudice.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I chose the title for this audience. I use a different title.
Okay, but more importantly, the point I want to really make is the question of history and tradition. You quoted Nietzsche several times, and Nietzsche had a book called On the Advantage and Disadvantage of History for Mankind or something like that. And he said that there are 3 different types of history. And he was writing particularly from the point of view of the experience of Western civilization. He said you can never have one type of history or one type of tradition in society. There are 3 types of histories. One, monumental history, which is history written from the point of view of the winners, the people at the top. And then you have antiquarian history, which is history written, which is concerned about conserving the past, whatever that past is. And then third, there's a history called critical history, which is history from the bottom up. History from the perspective of subaltern people, people who are ordinary, people who are voiceless. His conclusion was that if you really want to have a good balance, you want to have a good understanding of history or tradition, you have to take all these 3 perspectives into consideration, because if you do not, you're going to end up with a lopsided history. So my feeling is that Bach he seems to me to be a privileged person. I recognize his contribution because I feel I'm in between his position and that of Thomas Paine. I think we cannot just imagine ourselves out of traditional history. It's impossible. But at the same time, history has never been experienced the same way by any people, whether in ancient Greek civilization, in the Roman Empire, in ancient Egypt, or in contemporary United States. And it will never be experienced that way insofar as there's inequality of power and privileges. And especially when we promote market economy, and I'm not making any judgment about whether capitalism is good or bad, I don't want to get into that. But the mere fact that if you distribute resources through the market, some people are going to be winners, some people are going to be losers. Now, whatever your opinion is about that, I do not care. But the point I'm trying to make is that if I have $1 million, my children and myself would have a totally different experience in the United States compared to making a few $1,000s. I'm not disappreciating my job in Bethel.
Well, I think all of what you said is valid, and actually Burke does write quite a bit about people from Ireland and people from India who are from the bottom. So he's really worth looking at. But I think I agree. Again, to quote Tocqueville, the principles of Tocqueville goes back and forth between our equality and liberty, and these are going to be tensions within our society, regardless of what we do. We allow more liberty, that means there's going to be more inequality. We produce more equality, there is going to be a reduction of liberty, unless we achieve that utopia, which we never will. So I think we have to live and manage the tension. Yeah. Who's keeping time here? We have maybe time for one more? Yeah. Naomi?
You've given us a definition of prejudice according to Burke and how it was understood at that time. I'm wondering why you chose to use the word prejudice today, given the context today and the meaning that that word has today and its connotations.
Well, it's the word that occurs in both Burke and Gadamer. And I think it forces people to confront, lively language forces people to confront things that they wouldn't ordinarily think about. So that's why I did. Well, thank you very much. I'll be glad to stay around for a few more minutes if you'd like. Or if you want to buy one of these very unconscionably expensive books.